In case you haven't figured out, I'm Dr. Khoi, and this is Max Butte. Welcome to the Disney room. I always think that sign, nonfiction, must be so confusing for the kids who come in here, but it's good to know. Max Butte is, as many of you know, he is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been the advisor to 3 different presidential campaigns.
All of whom lost.
McCain, Romney, and Rubio. And he, before going to the Council on Foreign Relations, was at the Wall Street Journal for 8 years and served as the editor of the op-ed page. Before that was at the Christian Science Monitor, and before that was a conservative columnist at Berkeley. So he's ready for anything. There's nothing you can do that will faze this guy.
I've come a long way, baby.
He's a military historian now. He's written 3 books, books about the small wars, guerrilla warfare, books about military technology. The Road Not Taken is his first foray into biography, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer in that category. So we're so happy to have you here to talk about Edward Lansdale, who seems like a stuff of nonfiction and fiction at once.
Well, it's a delight to be here with all of you. I mean, what a wonderful event. I mean, this truly reaffirms my faith in America to see all these folks out here in the middle of the week interested in talking about and hearing about books. So this is such a wonderful festival. First time here, but I will be back. I mean, this is awesome to see, and it's a pleasure to talk with Khoi, who has a very similar. We were just comparing notes backstage, and we actually have very similar trajectories because we both became Americans in the bicentennial year of 1976. In his case, coming from South Vietnam at the age of 14. In my case, coming from the Soviet Union at age 6. So we're both refugees from communism who are very blessed to be here as Americans today. And it's really a privilege to talk about my book on Ed Lansdale because he was somebody who was a legendary figure and I think had come to be forgotten, and somebody who was widely believed to be the model for both the ugly American as well as the quiet American. And it was truly an eye-opening research odyssey for me to uncover the real story of Ed Lansdale with a hidden love affair and his great passion in life for a Filipino woman named Pat Kelly, and what he really did on behalf of the CIA in the Philippines and Vietnam. Truly an epic story. And so, by the end of that time, after, like 6 years of researching Ed Lansdale, I went to Arlington National Cemetery and went to his grave, and I felt like, wow, I know more about this guy than I know about my own father. Now, that's partly a reflection of my relationship with my father, but it's also a reflection of just how deeply I delved into Ed's background, and I felt like, and the Lansdale family was very nice to me, and I felt like I'd become kind of an adopted member of the Lansdale clan along the way.
So I'm going to put in a shameless plug for the book. It's history, it's biography, but it reads like a novel, and it's an adventure story it's a spy thriller. It's a very moving love story, actually. And he'll talk about the relationship with the 2 women in his life. For me, it was also a view into the Vietnam War, the conflict, and a perspective that I had not had before. It also reads a little bit like a Dale Carnegie on like how to influence people, because Edward Lansdale was so good at that. And then it's also a bit of a cautionary tale on how we should think about conflicts and hotspots around the world now. But I understand that you kind of came across Edward Lansdale when you were researching writing Invisible Armies. Is that right?
Indeed, I was, because my previous book before this one was called Invisible Armies, which was a history of guerrilla warfare since the dawn of time. I always choose the small topics. And I had a couple of chapters in which Ed Lansdale featured pretty prominently in my discussion of the Vietnam War. And then I remember after that book came out and I sat down with my editor, tremendous editor at Norton, Bob Weil, and Bob and I were talking about what do I do next, and he said, well, why don't you do a whole book on Ed Lansdale, and I was pretty skeptical initially. I tend to be skeptical when people propose things to me, and I said, well, I've already done Ed Lansdale. Why do I need to do him again? And Bob just had this intuition that there was more to be said, and boy, was he right. And I very quickly discovered that there was this whole other side of Ed Lansdale that people knew very little about, and there had been so much mythology about his life. I mean, he's somebody, any history of the Vietnam War, he's mentioned, whether you're reading Stanley Carnow or anybody else, David Halberstam, there's always mentions of Ed Lansdale, but they didn't really understand the real Ed Lansdale. And one of the turning points for my research was when I was aware that his second wife, Pat Kelly, this woman from the Philippines, despite her name, was somebody that he had a previous relationship with while he was married to his first wife, Helen. I was sort of vaguely aware of that, but then I tracked down Pat Kelly's grandchildren because her granddaughter had died, but her grandchildren were still alive. A couple of them in Northern Virginia, one in the Philippines, and I managed to track them down. And I called up, one of the granddaughters named Patricia, and said, "Would you be willing to meet with me?" And she said, "Okay." And then I came over to her house, big house in Northern Virginia, and she said, "I have all these letters that Ed Lansdale wrote to my grandmother. Would you be interested in those?" And I said, "Wow, I mean, that's like, asking like a gold prospector, I've got this gold mine. Would you be interested in that?" So I said, "Yes, you'd better believe I'd be interested." And so I remember going downstairs to the basement of her house, and there's a big ping pong table out there, and all these letters are laid out on the ping pong table. Many of them are still in their original envelopes, neatly tied with ribbons. Just amazing, amazing treasure trove. This is something that you can only dream about as a biographer, and it offers this not only a window into this hidden relationship, which was actually incredibly important to his life, and people did not understand how important Pat Kelly was because she was somebody who really introduced him to Filipino culture and made possible his first great success, which was masterminding the defeat of the Huk Rebellion, HUK, the communist rebels in the Philippines in the 40s and 50s. She was somebody who allowed him to understand Filipino culture, very complicated story that he did not leave his wife for her, and so she kind of remained in the shadows. But reading those letters, it was like it was a kind of revealing window into what he was thinking and feeling at those times, which was then combined with, I was lucky enough to also get the cooperation of the kids, the two boys that Ed and his first wife Helen had together. They're not such little boys anymore, they're in their 70s. And they shared with me the letters that he had written to their mother, often simultaneously with the letters that he was writing to his longtime mistress, Pat Kelly. And so I was actually the first person after Ed Lansdale himself to have read both sets of letters. And it was just on this unparalleled vantage point. It's very interesting to see, by the way, in that initially the letters to the wife from the Philippines and Vietnam were actually in many ways more revealing about his work challenges, the actual job that he was doing on behalf of the military and the CIA, because they were very matter of fact. They were, "Honey, here's what happened at the office today. Here's how I helped to determine the outcome of the Philippine election," that kind of thing. Whereas the letters to Pat Kelly initially were much more of the heavy breathing variety, and I really felt like a voyeur reading them because I learned about that, special spot behind Pat's knee and
it's a Disney room.
Yes. I'll try to keep it at the PG-13 level. But
Thank you.
I feel like, yes, in some ways I felt like I learned more than I needed to know about the Ed and Pat relationship. And there were many in the early years, there were certainly many repetitions in these letters of "I love you, I love you, I love you," said about 2,000 different ways. But then I'm sure all of you will be shocked to hear this. This is completely outside of your normal experience, I'm sure. But after about 5 years of the Pat Kelly Ed Lansdale relationship, his letters to Pat also became much more matter of fact and much more about his work environment.
Yeah. Ed Lansdale, so CIA spy, and I think we all have a kind of a notion of what it means to be a spy. We think about Jason Bourne, or was there anything in Ed's childhood or early anything that foretold the man or the job that he would take on?
Well, there were definitely childhood influences, and very briefly on Ed Lansdale. He was born in Detroit in 1908. His father was a automobile executive in the early years of the industry. They moved around a lot, but he basically wound up spending his teenage years in California, in Los Angeles. Kind of an indifferent student, went to UCLA, dropped out at the height of the Depression, moved to New York hoping to become a novelist or cartoonist or something like that. That did not succeed, and so he moved back to California, and like a lot of frustrated writers, went into advertising and had a very successful advertising career primarily in San Francisco. And then when World War II broke out, he enlisted in the OSS. He was not sent overseas, but he did various assignments stateside, and then also got a commission as an Army intelligence officer. And then finally in 1945, as the war was ending and as millions of GIs were coming home, he shipped out on his first overseas assignment to the Philippines, where he worked on behalf of the Army, eventually transferred to the Air Force, eventually, years later, became a 2-star Air Force general. But then he also performed his most important missions on behalf of the CIA, or even precursors of the CIA before the CIA existed, and really determining the political fate of both the Philippines and South Vietnam. And we can talk more about that, but if you just ask about, childhood influence, is very interesting because, he never visited Asia until, he was something like 40 years old. But there were things that you can point to in his childhood, and among them was the fact that he was tremendously and impressively devoid of racial prejudice, growing up at a time in the 19-teens and 20s where there was virulent racism against Asian Americans, right? I mean, this was the time when we had the 1924 Immigration Act, which excluded all Asian immigration, and there was tremendous, animus in California where he was growing up, and he was always devoid of that prejudice. He always, treated people of whatever race or color as being entirely his equals, and this in many ways was the secret of his success in the Philippines and in Vietnam, because in both places, people in those countries had gotten used to kind of the condescension and racism of Westerners who thought that they knew better than anybody else and would come in and act in a very arrogant fashion. And that was not Ed Lansdale in the slightest. Ed was always incredibly kind, nice, warm. He really had a gift for friendship. He made, obviously he made a very lasting connection with Pat Kelly, his mistress, but he made many close connections with friends of all kinds, including Ramon Magsaysay, who was the Minister of Defense in the Philippines, and with Lansdale's help in 1953 became the president of the Philippines, and perhaps still to this day, the greatest president the Philippines has ever had. So, and he develops a relationship like a brother with him, and then later on with No Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, who was a much more prickly figure, not kind of as gregarious and outgoing as Magsaysay, but Lansdale managed to win him over as well. And it was really, I think, that lack of racial prejudice and his ability to connect with people on a human-to-human level and to really listen to them. And that was, ultimately the secret of his success. I mean, I could just as easily have called this book The Listener, because the way that Lansdale influenced people was by listening to them. And that's not always easy to do with somebody like No Dinh Diem, who was a notorious windbag, and he would bore the pants off most of his American interlocutors because he would be sitting there droning on for hour after hour about the minutiae of Vietnamese politics, and most Americans by that point were ready to jump out the window. But Lansdale would sit there very, very patiently, listening to him, drinking his little cups of coffee, and say, "Oh, that's fascinating, Mr. President. Now, if I understand what you're saying, it's this." And then he would very subtly rephrase what he had just been told to basically get across his own advice, his own input, but making it sound as if the other person had thought of it himself. Now, that's a pretty basic stratagem, but it works. I mean, it doesn't just work with heads of state. It works with your spouse. It works with your boss. It works with anybody. Try it yourself. See what I mean?
So I think what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
There you go.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
But he had like 2 stints in the Philippines, and it's so fascinating when he got there. It almost seems like he took it on himself to really understand the Philippines, and you describe all these different things, trips that he took and forays into
Yes.
the...
Yeah, no, this is what really distinguished Ed Lansdale from so many American emissaries, because there is kind of the Americans, even to this day, kind of have this big white brother habit that we go to these foreign countries and we tell them what they're supposed to do with very little knowledge of what the actual situation is. I've seen that personally myself many times in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and that was not the Lansdale approach at all. His approach was really, his method was based on understanding what was going on before he could formulate any advice or before he could formulate a plan of action. And he really, he spent years in the Philippines, as you rightly say, from 1945 to 1948, and again from 1950 to 1954. And he spent a lot of time getting to know Filipinos, going into the boondocks, the backcountry, often very dangerous forays into areas that were controlled by the hooks, by the communist insurgents. And this, by the way, was where he really created his friendship and romance with Pat Kelly, because she was somebody who was actually from the same part of Luzon province as many of the hook leaders. And so she said, hey, I can show you where the communist rebels are from, and you can understand the environment that's created them. And so they would get in a Jeep and drive out of Manila and go to these very dangerous areas where no other Americans would ever go. And that is how he learned what is at the root of the insurgency and how do you defeat the insurgency. And he understood it wasn't going to be defeated through firepower. It had to be defeated by addressing the real grievances that these poor Filipinos had, who were denied land, who were denied political power, who were oppressed by this corrupt oligarchy. And he really had to address some of their grievances in order to take away the fuel that was behind the communist insurgency. And so that was always the basis of his approach. He was almost like an anthropologist in uniform, seeking to understand everything about him. And if you ever read the book, The Ugly American, there is a character in there based on Ed Lansdale called Colonel Hillendale, and it was written by one of the authors of The Ugly American was a friend of Lansdale's, a Navy captain, and he kind of exaggerated Lansdale and had him like playing his harmonica in the countryside and speaking Tagalog and so forth. And he was actually handicapped because he was, in one way, a typical American, and I plead guilty to this as well. He was horrible with languages. He didn't actually speak Tagalog. He didn't speak Vietnamese. He didn't even speak French. That wasn't as much of a barrier in the Philippines, of course, because so many people spoke English. But he was tremendous about communicating, even when he literally did not speak your language. He could establish that kind of human connection, and really, he had a gift of empathy.
And Pat Kelly, as she wasn't just a socialite she was a heavy. I mean, she was a woman of substance. She was a widow. Kelly's a strange name. She's I guess, Filipina of Chinese descent, and was a journalist, I think. And they would hop in his Jeep and they would take these trips into the backcountry. And they had some dangerous adventures.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one time they were held up by bandits and could have easily been killed. So he certainly risked his neck to figure out what was going on the ground.
And she was this entree into society, explained the culture. So,
Right.
so he really gained this view, this in-depth view of the Philippines. And then came back to the U.S., you said, where he met Ramon Magsaysay, who was doing a kind of a tour through the U.S.
Right.
And kind of tabbed him as, this might be a guy we should back.
Yeah, no, exactly. He established a very close relationship with Ramon Magsaysay, who was also a very impressive figure. He had been a guerrilla fighter against the Japanese in World War II, then became a Philippine senator, and then eventually in 1950 was appointed Minister of Defense at a time when it looked like the Philippines might go the way of other countries in Asia that had fallen to communism, China, of course, and others. And that this was at the time when the Korean War was raging, and there were actually plans that were drawn up in Washington to send multiple U.S. combat divisions to the Philippines because, we did not want to see a communist takeover in the Philippines. But mercifully, those plans were never executed, in large part because the entire army was tied down fighting the Korean War. And so, the basic decision that was made by a fellow named Frank Wisner, who was director of the Office of Policy Coordination, which was a precursor of the CIA, and later director of operations for the CIA, Wisner basically decided and won the support of the Truman administration to, instead of sending multiple army divisions, they said, let's send Ed Lansdale with basically 3 or 4 other guys to help him out. Let's see what they can do. And so this was a very daunting assignment, as daunting as you can imagine in 1950, with another country in Asia on the verge of falling to communism. And Lansdale arrives without any American troops at his back, just a small advisory group, but he succeeds because he influences Magsaysay, and he convinces Magsaysay of what is today would be considered counterinsurgency 101, but at that time this was a very cutting-edge idea, and the basic idea was you can't kill your way to success, because if you're just bombing barrios, if you're killing people, you're creating more enemies than you're eliminating, because you're killing innocent civilians, you're driving them into the arms of the rebels. This is, what is today called population-centric counterinsurgency, but back then Lansdale was really one of the pioneers of this, along with British Field Marshal Templer in Malaya, who was operating at virtually the same time. So the idea that Lansdale came up with was, instead of trying to kill your way to victory, why don't we love our way to victory? Treat the people as your brothers, love them, make the people trust the army, that the army will protect them, the army will not steal from them, will not rape them, will not pillage them, will not kill them, and instead the army will be there to protect them. And once the people become confident they can trust the army, they will then rat out the insurgents in their midst, because they will have the confidence that the army will protect them. And that was essentially counterinsurgency 101, an idea that Ed Lansdale developed and that he sold to Magsaysay, and basically made Magsaysay think he had thought of it himself. And together they actually implemented and rooted out corruption in the Philippine army, convinced the Philippine army to stop killing civilians, to stop robbing them. That's how Ed Lansdale won defeated the Hook Rebellion. It was really through his ability to become as close as a brother to Magsaysay, and therefore influence the way that the war was being fought. And this is something there are not many examples in American history of anybody else who's been that successful in pulling that off.
It's although he didn't coin the phrase, I think the hearts and minds, winning the hearts and minds was the.
Yeah.
And besides that, he also had a strong belief that people had to trust in the ballot. And that was a big part of it, not bullets, but ballots, that
Right,
you had to
because
have fair elections.
Right, because the Hook slogan was bullets, not ballots, because they didn't trust the election process. It was fraudulent, it was rigged by the corrupt oligarchy. And so what Lansdale understood was the key to beating the Hooks wasn't to defeat them on the military battlefield. The key to defeating them was to defeat them politically, and to convince ordinary Filipinos that their voices could actually be heard in a free and fair electoral process. So a lot of what he did was simply organizing election observers from all these civil society organizations to make sure that the vote was free and fair. Of course, the other part that he did, which people did not know so much about at the time, and which I've learned from the release of all these top secret CIA archives, was Lansdale became convinced that Magsaysay was the only person who had the integrity and the standing to be a successful president of the Philippines. And so he basically became his de facto campaign manager, using his secret CIA resources to help Lansdale, to help Magsaysay. But he wasn't committing ballot fraud. He was basically just masterminding the campaign in a way that, a Karl Rove might do. He even came up with the slogan for Magsaysay in 1953, which is "Magsaysay is my guy," and so Magsaysay became known as the guy throughout the Philippines. And so that was really Lansdale's contribution. And of course, at the end of 1953, Magsaysay won a landslide victory. But again, it wasn't because Lansdale was stuffing the ballot box or committing some dirty, underhanded tricks. It was because Magsaysay was genuinely popular and ran a successful campaign.
But he wasn't all just about these noble principles. There are some, he did bring his ad background into some of the Psy war tactics against the Hooks.
Lansdale definitely had a weakness for what would be called black psychological operations as well. There's kind of the white stuff, which is, above board, which is like, the slogan for Magsaysay and his campaign and so forth. And there was the stuff below the surface. And he did have a weakness, like a lot of OSS veterans, for dirty tricks and doing things like, because he was aware through his folklore that a lot of Filipinos in the countryside were very superstitious and thought that there were vampires lurking around. And so he arranged for, a hook column to be ambushed by the Philippine army, where they seized a hook who was killed, and then they put a couple of holes in his neck and hung him up, and then spread a rumor that he'd been killed by a vampire. And so he loved pulling off stuff like this, and this became part of his legend. At the CIA headquarters in Washington, people would be saying, "Can you get a load of this Lansdale guy? I can't believe what he is doing." And that really led to a lot of his legend and reputation are tales about some of these dirty tricks that he pulled off, and he subsequently did the same in Vietnam. But again, I would stress that was not really that was stuff he did, but it wasn't really the core of his success. The core of his success was really waging political warfare.
But he has incredible success in the Philippines, and he helps their guy, our guy, whoever his guy, win
Right.
the election. He's nicknamed Colonel Landslide,
Yes.
instead of Colonel Lansdale, and so 1954, another hotspot is popping up in Southeast Asia, so his name comes up as the guy.
Right, 1954. Remember what's going on in the world. Dien Bien Phu is falling. The French Empire in Indochina is collapsing. Ho Chi Minh is about to take power, and of course this causes panic in Washington because, again, they're afraid of this red tide sweeping over Asia. But once again, nobody really wants to send a lot of American combat troops because, again, this is right after the end of the Korean War. Nobody wants to really see a repetition of that. And so once again, this time it's the Eisenhower administration, as they're sitting around thinking, well, what do we do about Vietnam? I mean, it seemed like because the Geneva Convention the Geneva Conference was going to create two states in Vietnam. You're going to have communist North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, who had tremendous credibility as the leader who had defeated the French imperialists, and then you have this non-communist state in South Vietnam that nobody knew that it could be viable. Nobody thought it would last 5 minutes, and President Eisenhower had no desire to send American combat troops. But again, they were brainstorming in Washington, and basically Allen Dulles, who by this time was director of the CIA, said, well, we've got this Colonel Lansdale. He had tremendous success in another Asian country in the Philippines, so why don't we send him to Vietnam to do what he did in the Philippines? And so it was that in the summer of 1954, shortly after the formation of the state of South Vietnam, and a few weeks before Ngo Dinh Diem was appointed its prime minister, Ed Lansdale showed up on a one-way ticket to Saigon.
So it's actually the Dulles brothers, right? That he's got these powerful patrons in Washington. They were really power brokers, those two brothers.
Yes, and they had tremendous confidence because
Secretary of State and head of CIA.
Yes,
is that
John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, CIA director, and they loved the Eisenhower administration. Was in some ways the heyday of American covert action, sometimes successful, sometimes not. But they loved these swashbuckling covert operatives like Kim Roosevelt, who helped to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, or Ed Lansdale, who helped Edward Magsaysay to prevail in the Philippines. Those kinds of swashbuckling covert operatives had tremendous credibility in the Eisenhower administration, and so Lansdale was sent to deal with this other pesky situation in Southeast Asia.
It seems so understandable that you have a guy who had this unparalleled success in this Southeast country, and you got this other Southeast Asian country. But as a Vietnamese person, I look at it and say, well, those are completely different situations with a lot of obstacles in the Vietnam situation that didn't exist in the Philippines.
Right. I mean, there's a reason why Lansdale was not as successful in Vietnam as he was in the Philippines. I mean, it was actually...
There's no Vietnamese Pat Kelly, right? I mean, it's actually a big...
No, and in some ways he literally did not speak the language, and certainly in Vietnam in the 50s, very few people spoke English. French was the foreign language. Of course, it changed by the time he returned in the mid-60s. A lot of Vietnamese spoke English by that time for obvious reasons. But he had, but what he was able to accomplish in the 50s was beyond all expectations, because again, nobody expected that the state of South Vietnam would last 5 minutes. or that ZM would last 5 minutes because he had such heavy odds against them, against this well-oiled Viet Minh military machine that had defeated the French and was now in charge of North Vietnam with tremendous credibility as the champions of nationalism, the defeaters of the French, and so forth. And Lansdale basically started working behind the scenes, cultivated ZM, who was a much more prickly and difficult character than Magsaysay. And this was really the height of ZM's success, a lot of it driven by Lansdale's advice. And he really pushed ZM out of his monkish lair. I mean, ZM was somebody who thought about becoming a Catholic priest. He was not very comfortable talking to people. He was kind of a typical Confucian Mandarin in some ways. And he was certainly no, glad-handing politician, but Lansdale kind of pushed him out of his comfort zone, made him become a more popular leader, and masterminded the defeat of these various sect armies, because at that time, it wasn't even clear that the South Vietnamese army, which was just been created, would even be able to control South Vietnam, because you had all of these religious sects like the Cao Dai and criminal sects like the Binh Xuyen, that they actually had larger armies than the National Army. And so there was a civil war. Not only was there a threat from the Communist North, there was a civil war going on in South Vietnam in 1954, 1955. And it was, there was a Battle of Saigon in 1955. People forget about it. It was actually the deadliest fighting in Saigon until the Tet Offensive in 1968. And Lansdale put his chips on ZM at a time when few people in Washington thought that he would succeed, and a lot of people wanted to get rid of him and thought that because the French hated ZM because he was anti-French, and a lot of people in the Eisenhower administration, including the U.S. ambassador Lightning Joe Collins, were very skeptical of him, but Lansdale backed him all the way, and this often involved acts of extreme insubordination, which he became famous for, like when Lightning Joe Collins, who was a 4-star U.S. Army general, hero of World War II, close friend of President Eisenhower, when he arrived in 1954 to be the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, and he immediately wanted to start slashing U.S. aid to ZM, start slashing the size of the U.S. Army, and he was meeting with his country team at the U.S. Embassy, and he said, "Is that clear? Any questions, anybody?" And of course, when a 4-star general says, "Any questions, anybody?" he means those are the orders, get out and execute. And of course, Lansdale, never very shy, stood up and said, "I have some problems, sir," and he made the case that you couldn't actually downsize the army because the army was the only instrument of the government that could actually administer these areas where the Viet Minh communist fighters were vacating, and it had to be expanded to incorporate all these militia fighters who were being demobilized. Otherwise, you would have chaos in the countryside. And General Collins listened to Lansdale, who was a colonel at the time, for a couple of minutes and said, "You're out of order, mister. I am the personal representative of the President of the United States, and I'm telling you the way we're going to do things." And Lansdale stood up and said, "Well, sir, you may be the personal representative of the President of the United States, but I'm confident if the people of the United States could hear what you had to say, they would disagree with you. And I'm here to stand up on behalf of the people of the United States. On behalf of the people of the United States, I'm walking out on you." And out he walked out the door. So don't try this at home. It's probably not going to work very well. But in his case, his rank and subordination to this 4-star general succeeded because of what we were just talking about, because he had the support of the Dulles brothers, who were the ultimate kingmakers in Washington. And so he got his way, and the U.S. government continued backing ZM.
In your book, when you write about him, it really seems like he was such a PR guy, too. One of the first big things that he got involved in when he came to Vietnam was Vietnam had just been partitioned, and there was a period where both sides would allow people to migrate freely. So you could choose if you wanted to go south, or you could choose to go north, and I think that was called Passage to Freedom. Mm-hmm. And Lansdale got pretty involved with that, or some PR campaign.
Right, because what Lansdale did was he understood that it was imperative to lure more people from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, especially Catholics who were going to support the ZM regime, and so he arranged with the U.S. Navy to transport hundreds of thousands of people to the South. That was called Operation Passage to Freedom. But remember, being an old advertising man and having a weakness for psychological operations, there had to be a PR component to this as well. For example, he hired a soothsayer to produce an almanac that predicted good fortune for South Vietnam and bad fortune for North Vietnam. So, he did all these kinds of things to goose along the immigration. And this was a huge success for the Diem government because nearly 1 million Catholics went from north to south, and that tremendously strengthened the South Vietnamese regime.
And he did some fake news things too, some leaflets that he would print up and have distributed around Hanoi.
Right. No, he would distribute these fake leaflets reporting to come from Ho Chi Minh's government, advising everybody to dress very warmly because they were about to be sent to Manchuria to work on the railroads or something like that.
Right.
So he would, he loved like this kind of black propaganda where he would pretend to be sending messages from the other side that would actually undermine the other side.
Bring an inventory of all your belongings.
Right, exactly.
And atomic bomb-like zones.
Right. He pulled out all the stops for sure.
Yeah. And he may have been involved with Thomas Dooley's book about Deliver Us from Evil. I don't know if people read Reader's Digest back then. It was Thomas Dooley was a Notre Dame grad.
His biggest PR coup, I'll just do this very briefly, was The Quiet American, the Graham Greene novel, which was very anti-American. And people thought that the main character was actually based on Lansdale, although that probably was not the case. But
Alden Pyle.
Alden Pyle, yeah. But this do-gooder who didn't know what he was doing, but great novel. But then this Hollywood filmmaker, Joseph Mankiewicz, decided to film The Quiet American with Audie Murphy in the part of Alden Pyle. And Mankiewicz came to Vietnam, and Mankiewicz was kind of an old Cold War style liberal. He came to Vietnam, met with Ed Lansdale, and Ed Lansdale suggested some crucial twists in the plot to basically subvert Graham Greene's message. And so if you actually see the movie, the plot, although it has a lot of similarities, is completely different. It's basically much more of a pro-American movie, where it's showing that the communists are the bad guys who are behind these nefarious machinations. The Americans are actually well-intentioned and the good guys. And so Graham Greene hated the movie because it was completely the opposite of his message, and he had no idea of how this had come about, but it was actually Ed Lansdale working behind the scenes to twist the message of the novel.
They switched it back again in the Michael Caine version.
Yes.
So if you're trying to
right, the Michael Caine version is faithful to the original.
So Lansdale and Diem kind of at their apogee of their success in 55, 56.
Right.
And then Lansdale returns to the U.S., and then over the next 7 years, this is a thesis of your book that we maybe gave up on Diem because Lansdale wasn't there, and that really changed the course of the war.
Right, and in part, I think, that was certainly part of my thesis, that by the early 60s, the U.S. government was very much at odds with Diem, and in part because there was nobody that Diem really trusted in the U.S. government in the way that he trusted Lansdale, and Lansdale kept trying to go over there. And there was even at one point where he met with John F. Kennedy early in 1961, and President Kennedy suggested that he might send him out there as the U.S. ambassador, but that didn't happen because he was ultimately torpedoed by people like his own boss at the Pentagon, Robert McNamara, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk and others who thought that he was too much of a lone wolf operator. Because remember what I said about the way that he was insubordinate to Ambassador Lightning Joe Collins, that worked for him in 1955 when he had the support of the Dulles brothers, but by the early 60s, he no longer had a champion like that in Washington. And it eventually caught up with him because basically the regular CIA, the State Department, and the Department of Defense, they all hated his guts because they thought he was an insubordinate SOB who would not do what he was told to do. And there was some truth to that. He was basically a lone operator. He would do what he thought was right, not what other agencies or his superiors thought was right. And so he was basically blocked from going to Vietnam. And as a result of that, he became kind of the spectator as the situation spiraled out of control, leading eventually, of course, to the coup, which overthrew Ngo Dinh Diem and killed him and his brother. And that's what really, part of my thesis is that's what really unleashed the furies in Vietnam, because after Diem was gone, the government fell apart. You had military coup after military coup, complete chaos. The communists stepped up their infiltration of South Vietnam. And by that point, we had basically taken ownership of the state of South Vietnam because we had helped the generals to overthrow and kill the previous president. And the whole situation was collapsing. by 1964, and Lyndon Johnson basically was left feeling that South Vietnam was going to fall to the communists unless he wound up sending 500,000 American combat troops to save it. And that was the last thing that Ed Lansdale ever wanted, because Lansdale's perspective was, let's help the South Vietnamese to help themselves. We should provide them aid, we should send advisors, but we should not take over the fighting ourselves. And that advice was tragically disregarded by the Johnson administration. And my conclusion in the book, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that we would have, quote unquote, won the Vietnam War if only we'd listened to Ed Lansdale, because South Vietnam could have been doomed in any case. But the one thing that I would say for sure is, if we had listened to Lansdale, even if we'd still lost the war, we would not have lost 58,000 Americans fighting the war, and we would not have lost millions of Vietnamese who were casualties to our heavy use of combat firepower. So, whatever happened, whether we, quote, won or lost, it would have been at a much lower cost if Ed Lansdale had been listened to. And he was, ultimately wound up as this very tragic, anomalous figure, a little bit like his friend John Paul Vann, because both of them believed in helping South Vietnam, but both of them believed that this big unit conventional war that General Westmoreland was waging was doomed to failure, and they were utterly ignored by Westmoreland, McNamara, and Johnson. They were kind of helpless spectators as this tragedy reached its tragic denouement with the Tet Offensive in 1968.
It still seemed like we have so much to learn from Lansdale, whose philosophy of hearts and minds seems like it's been replaced by our warheads on foreheads
exactly.
policy.
Right. Yeah, in some ways we face the same problem today as we did in the 60s, which is that we are very technologically advanced. We know how to kill people, and we can actually kill them much more precisely today than we could kill them in the 1960s. It's no longer carpet bombing. It's now drone strikes and very smart bombs and that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with an insurgency, whether it's a communist insurgency, Islamist insurgency, any kind of insurgency, you can't kill your way to victory. The only way to win is to create a viable government that can win the allegiance of the people. And we're not very good at that. It's very hard to do if you're an outsider, to be fair. But we have not cultivated, we're great at targeting people, we're great at kinetic warfare, but we have not really cultivated that Lansdale skill set of empathy, of listening, of understanding. And so we've had these horrible tragedies where we've become at odds with our own client regimes, like with Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan or with Maliki in Iraq. We've been at odds with them almost as much as we once were with CM in the 1960s. And in all those cases, I think we could have had greater success if we had cultivated more of that Lansdale skill set of quiet persuasion.
And I think it's moving that Lansdale really espoused really good old-fashioned Americanism. And it's so unfashionable to say American exceptionalism, but he believed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He said the power of representative government, that the most effective way to get someone to be a counterinsurgent was for them to believe that their government was the best chance for their children.
Exactly.
And it's in one of his letters. It's so eloquent.
Yeah, he really believed that people had to have something to fight for, as well as something to fight against. And you can argue that he was naive, but he genuinely believed that the values embodied in the Declaration of Independence had universal appeal. It wasn't just for the United States. And he thought that the greatest thing we could do is not necessarily to subvert other people, although he engaged in some subversion, but it was really to champion those values and to work with like-minded individuals who were attracted to the same things that we stood for. And that can sometimes sound hopelessly naive, and it certainly sounded hopelessly naive in Vietnam by the mid-60s, when a lot of people were pretty jaded because we were mouthing the rhetoric of American liberties, but in fact we were engaging using Agent Orange in massive bombing raids, huge loss of life, and just the disparity between what we stood for and what we were doing just seemed too great, and we lost all credibility. But Lansdale was somebody who always believed in a lower level American intervention and trying to put those values first and foremost. And I would say he had a lot of success in the Philippines, some limited success early on in South Vietnam that was eventually dissipated. But I think there's still some lessons there that can usefully be applied to a lot of the challenges we face in the present day.
Max, thank you so much. It's a great
you.
book, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.